Hi guys, I'm Andrew and this is Safety Pilot. I've had opportunity to fly outside of the United States for an extended period of time, and I've also flown in the US for a couple of years. And the purpose of the video is to understand that not everybody flies the same way that you do in your country, and that the way that you fly in your country isn't necessarily the best way or the right way to fly. There's different ways that different countries have decided that general aviation should be practiced, and understanding how other people fly may benefit you where you fly. So 4 things I really enjoy, that I enjoyed overseas were using different pressure settings. I really enjoyed using QFE, which is code field elevation, or essentially when you land, your altimeter will read 0 every time. This is opposed to Q and H, which is used more commonly here in the United States, which is code nautical height, which is an average altimeter setting for a region. So not your particular airport, but for a region, they pick an average setting. And this usually equates to when you're on the ground and you set your altimeter, it will read the elevation of the airport just as it would read on a sectional. Plus or minus a few feet, because again it's an average for multiple airports and sometimes it's a very vast region. QFE used to be used in the United States, and it's being used less and less all around the world. It's the equivalent of a radial altimeter. So QFE is effectively used by many airlines still. It's used a lot in the military around the world, but less and less as radial altimeters again are coming out, and QNH works. I mean, you don't need QFE. QFE allows you to fly very nice patterns, I think, in general aviation, because every time you come to the airplane environment or the airport environment, you're setting your pressure setting so that if you're going to fly a 1,000-foot pattern, your altimeter will always read 1,000 feet in the pattern. It won't read field elevation plus 1,000 feet. It's always going to be just 1,000, which allows you, if you want to lose 200 in the downwind, 300 in base, 500 to final, you're always flying the same numbers. You're flying 1,000, 800, 500, 0. So it's very nice in that regard. The downfall of QFE is if you have a very congested environment with multiple airports, say one airport here, another one 5 miles away or 10 miles away, you're going to run into problems with aircraft taking off with different pressure settings, which could cause mid-air collisions or near misses. So in highly congested areas, it's more dangerous. You also run into problems in mountainous terrain where pressure settings can change very quickly if you're climbing really high, and if one airport's located, again, maybe just 50 miles away, but it's 4,000 feet higher, again, you're going to have problems using QFE. So QNH has widely taken over. QFE is mostly unheard of in general aviation in the US, but it is used overseas and it has benefits, and it's nice, it's convenient if you get used to it. Another thing I enjoyed using was navigational wind. In the US, we talk about meteorological wind, which is where is the weather coming from? Where is the wind blowing from? If the wind is 050, I know the wind is coming from the northeast. It used to be really common to use so-called navigational wind for navigation. It's what flight planners would use, navigators would use, the military would frequently use it, and it was very common during World War II. It's still very common in other countries around the world as an effective way of flying, but especially with advanced technology and glass flight, it doesn't really matter as much anymore, because we're not making the calculations ourselves. We're relying on just very basic calculations. We don't need to know exactly when I'm going to get somewhere 100 miles away, because we have things like GPS and ATC radar and all of that to tell us where we're going and where we are. The third thing is where you enter and exit the pattern. All pilots have done pattern operations at some point in their flying, and it's very important, a very core part of our flying. And the question comes down to, how do you enter and exit that pattern, especially when there are other aircraft around? The common way to do it in the United States under the FAA's recommended list is to enter in the downwind at a 45-degree angle, or to cross over midfield and do either a direct entry into the downwind or a teardrop entry into the downwind. One problem I have with that is that where exactly you do your 45 entry into the downwind, if you're doing it midfield or if you're doing it closer to the crosswind turn, pilots tend to differ on that, even though there is a recommended variant to it. One way that I saw overseas of pilots doing it was entering at the so-called corners. So they wouldn't even call a pattern by downwind, crosswind, upwind, or base. They would just say corner 1, corner 2, corner 3, corner 4, and you would either enter or exit at a corner. What I liked about that is it's much easier to identify a corner than it is to identify a whole leg of the pattern. So if I say I'm in the downwind, I could be anywhere basically on a 2-mile stretch, depending on the length of the runway. If you have a really long runway, it could be 2 miles. If you have a shorter runway, it might be half a mile or a mile long stretch that I could be when I'm making a downwind call. If I'm making a corner call, it's not an exact position, but it is much less than a whole mile stretch. So if I say I'm on turn 2, that's what I'd make my pattern call. I would be turning to the downwind. Now, I think pilots in the US have realized this, and it's much more common now to hear calls rather than midfield downwind or just downwind, to hear calls turning downwind. So that's essentially the same thing, and it is becoming a lot more popular in the US, and that probably will be the status quo within the next 5 to 10 years. But it's something to think about. Where are we entering and exiting the pattern, and how can we be very precise in letting other pilots in the area know that? I think the corner method works better than the leg method. The fourth thing I preferred overseas more was different ways of flying the pattern. The typical way of flying the pattern in the US is a typical rectangular course pattern with 90-degree turns at each corner. Another way that I know of to fly is the circuit, which is instead of making 2 90-degree turns, you just make, with a round out in between, you just make a steady 180-degree turn from upwind to downwind and then from downwind to final. The benefits of that are, I think you have great visibility. People argue that you don't have as much of a danger of creating an overbanking situation, which could lead to a stall spin. You have less chance of overshooting final. Some of the downsides might be that you don't get that leveling out portion during for example, your crosswind or your base, which allows you to configure the airplane, look for traffic either on final or on the runway, or in the downwind when you're leveling out on crosswind. So that's one way of flying it. I don't often fly those patterns, but I do know they are popular around the world. I know the military also commonly flies them. But the fourth way of flying the pattern is the way that I prefer. I don't fly it like this in the US because it's not what pilots expect, but I do see that it has a lot of benefits, and I'm sure there are pilots who do fly like this. It involves avoiding the most dangerous part of the pattern in terms of having an engine loss, which would be corner 2 and corner 3, the beginning and the end of downwind, when you're the farthest from the runway and you're at your lowest relative altitude for length away from the runway, which means you have your worst glide performance, especially on corner 3 when you'll have headwind getting back to the runway. It's dangerous to be at a low altitude and that far away from the runway if your engine fails or if you have some other type of emergency. So this type of pattern involves not cutting, but from the downwind turning 135 degrees rather than 90 degrees. So your base is essentially going to be a slant back towards the tip of the runway, the approach end of the runway, which allows you to get back faster, to cut down the distance. It's similar to what you do in a 180 power off approach. The benefits again are you keep better sight of the runway during your approach. You get back closer to the runway, and I think you have less chance of overshooting final, as you now need to make just a 45-degree turn to get on final rather than a 90-degree turn to get on final, which could reduce the chances of getting into an overturn tendency and a stall spin situation. Some of the downsides are you have less time on final to get configured for landing, less time on final to put in wind corrections if you need a crosswind component or anything like that. So there definitely are downsides to it, but overall it was the common way to fly where I flew overseas, and I got really accustomed to it, and I think it definitely has some benefits, and I enjoy flying patterns that way. I think it's a great way to fly them all the time, not just on power off 180 situations. Get back to the runway and set up for landing.